Hello, everyone. Today is my birthday and Dr. G's birthday and Brent's birthday. It's January 20th. It is 4 o'clock Eastern, and we are here to talk about inclusion and diversity and how to be an ally. This will be a webinar series again, so those that are with us are on the chat and able to share their thoughts, and we'll hopefully be able to pull up some polls, get some other thoughts. I am Nathan Wood, Executive Director with the Construction Progress Coalition, as a host of this webinar series. Again, a little bit about just why we're here as CPC, as really a technology and data interoperability organization focused on things like inclusion and diversity. And it really starts with that caring for people, and the importance of understanding that empathy, not ego, is how we're going to move forward as an industry. And that so much of the challenges that we are facing are with the processes and the systems that are in place. And so how do we work together to advance the industry together? So excited to really have that conversation around this important topic of inclusion and diversity. Of course, these are not possible without all of our member supporters from Procore and Mortenson and all the way down the list. So thank you everyone for supporting the CPC and everything that we try and do to advance the industry. So this topic of how to be an ally, we're going to talk about how might we define allyship and the role of leadership to take action against bias and discrimination in ways that create spaces to learn from our different perspectives within the messy middle stage, so that we prioritize the presence of women and minorities as future leaders and change makers. So without further ado, Sasha Reed is going to take over and be our great moderator, our Oprah of AEC. So without that, go ahead and take it away, Sasha.
Thank you, Nathan. I appreciate it. Really excited for this conversation today, which is intended to be a follow-on to the last conversation that we had focused on diversity inclusion. In all frankness and honesty, in 2020, we did almost one roundtable per month in that year. And then in 2021, I told Nathan, I don't think I can do it. I don't think I can sustain having conversations with this level of complexity and depth every single month. So we did take a break and let this topic breathe. But Nathan, being the true curator that he is, really poked at me and said, hey, we need to bring this back to the surface and let's see where we are. So I kind of want to refresh your memory. The last conversation we had was with Maria Guy, who is a partner with Giant. Giant is an online leadership learning system, amazing system. And she talked about building the foundation for diversity and inclusion. When I originally met Maria and learned that she was working with leaders, executive construction leaders, I wanted to know, what are the conversations you're having around diversity and inclusion? And she said, I'm not. And I was a little bit taken aback. And she said, because there needs to be a foundation built first. So she was bringing to light the work that she does, really looking about building the foundation to have those conversations around diversity and inclusion. And she talked about this concept of when we're in a moment where you're experiencing bias and someone says something that's offensive to you. Being in 2022, we're now in a position where it's highly likely someone will speak up and make you aware that you've said something offensive. And she was discussing how she's working with leaders on saying, I want them to call each other up rather than call each other out. And we kind of asked her to define it. She says, one, you're literally creating a space to say, hey, this comment that you made didn't sit well with me. It's actually really offensive to me. And I think we can do better. Creating a space for that person to A, become aware that what they said was offensive, but two, hopefully create a space for some dialogue. Ultimate goal is for them to have a moment of self-reflection and increase their awareness and think about how they want to address something or a person of that nature in a future state. Versus calling out, which is essentially just putting that person on the spot saying, hey, I really didn't like what you said. I'm labeling you as this based on the language you just used and the way you made me felt, which doesn't necessarily create space for either party to learn or share perspectives. So that idea of calling someone up rather than calling someone out. And so today we wanted to kind of take that conversation one step further to turn that self-reflection that we hope comes in that moment into an action, into something that you can take action with. The idea of that next stage is when you become aware of something you've said that has been offensive. And if you take time to listen and learn and understand, you have the opportunity to say, I am going to adjust my language. I'm going to be more intentional in how I speak to others. And you have the opportunity to become an ally. And so today I really wanted to take that one step further and have a conversation around how to be an ally and define that and really get a sense of what does that mean. So when we do have moments where we're in these conversations and we reflect and decide we want to take action, we make sure that we don't cause unintentional harm. But we really look at how we're creating those spaces to learn, have difficult conversations and grow. So the panelists that we've selected here together is really to give us the ability to measure our progress from that last conversation we had till today, which there's been some time between those two conversations. And so really get a snapshot in time of how this journey looks from the perspective of our panelists. One thing I'll quickly note, Lilia Megayanis was supposed to join us on this panel, but unfortunately she's feeling under the weather, so she's not going to participate live. I think she is observing and may chat, but no pressure to her. I want her to focus on herself and feeling better. But the three panelists that we've assembled here do come from a diverse perspective, and we're really looking at their experiences as they're having conversations around inclusion and diversity in industry. I think the important thing for us as we're looking at this conversation is, and I say this all the time to Nathan, especially when you're talking to, I think it's technologists as well, but technologists, contractors, we're generally action-based people, biased to action. We want to know, okay, yes, okay, we can have a conversation, I can share understanding, but I need to know, what am I supposed to do? So this conversation is really intended to be a snapshot of where are we, have we made progress? And two, how do we really call each other up and activate ourselves as allies? And for those who are participating, who are in that minority, how do you identify those allies in your midst? The reality is we actually all need allies. It's not just our fellow minority coworkers and partners in industry. So what we want to do first, and this is truly because I am a data nerd, I always like to look at the data. So I want to look at what the data is telling us right now, just around the topic of women in construction and this idea of women and minorities as well, but really kind of focused on that women as that group here specifically. And we're seeing some wins. So what are the wins? According to the National Association of Women in Construction, the gender pay gap is significantly smaller in construction, where women earn on average 99% of what their male counterparts earn, which is high above other national averages. Where we're flat is in the total number of women and minorities in industry. And the levels you're looking at about 9 to 10% for women, 9 to 10% for African-American men, 0.2% for African-American women. And these numbers have remained at those levels for 25 years. So I think what we're seeing here is that we can attract that top talent from those communities, but we're not retaining them. So what is the challenge then that this data is kind of revealing to us? And the challenge is that when we look at the total number of workers in construction lost during the start of the pandemic, at the shutdown, at the onset of the pandemic, that number is 1 million workers. And that was before construction was classified as essential. And the industry has yet to win back just a fifth of those who were laid off during that period. And a recent Associated Builders and Contractors report noted that if the growth rate remains the same, we're looking at potentially needing to hire another 1 million workers in order to fulfill all the work that's in their backlog. So in summary, when we really look at this through a business lens, it's clear that there needs to be a deeper bench of workers, not only to deliver the work today, but think about your succession planning. Think about those leaders who are going to take over your businesses tomorrow and support our businesses and organizations who are in the process of making this change. So to do that, today I want to speak to each of our panelists here, giving them an opportunity to speak to their experience as they're leading in their own businesses and also guiding other leaders through these changes. And I think what we're going to do first is start with a poll question for everyone here first to start off with and kick off with, which is, in the last year, have you initiated an inclusion and diversity discussion in your organization? I'd love to see your answers here before we dive in with the panel. And our idea here is so this is somewhat interactive. So you have the opportunity to weigh in. We can get a sense from our audience of what your experiences are. And then I will turn it to our panelists to give us their input as well. And Nathan, there we go. Perfect. So hopefully you're seeing, this is interesting. So we're looking at 52. So over half of you are saying haven't had to have these conversations. You're looking at minority here, around 5% wanted to but couldn't. That makes me super happy. At 29%, so about a third of you are saying I did it and had really good results. Only about 14 said tried it, didn't go as planned. Okay, that snapshot tells us that, in my opinion, I feel like that's progress. The fact that we have spaces where we can have these conversations, the fact that that about a third of you have said, I've had the conversation, it went well. The other half that said, haven't had it, didn't had to, that's interesting. That's interesting to me. I'm curious to dive into that. But hopefully we can get a snapshot with that, with our panelists here. Nathan, I think I want to make sure I give the panelists a chance to introduce themselves. And I just don't want to mess up your, oh, I see what you're doing. I see what you're doing. Sorry, I was not in line. I see exactly what you're doing. So before I introduce the panelists, let's kind of start off with this topic. So the idea is, based on that poll response, want to get a sense for where we feel the industry is currently when it comes to advancing inclusion and diversity, what's working and what's not. Let's have the panelists introduce themselves so that you get to understand who it is that we're speaking to, what is the work that they're doing, and you get a sense for the context for the work that they're doing. So I'm going to start off and ask Alison to unmute herself. And Alison, can you introduce yourself, title, company, the work that you're doing? And if you have an answer to that poll question, great. If not, we'll dive into it next.
Sure. My name is Alison Hart. I am a project solutions manager with Mortenson Construction, which is a unique title, but mainly I work out of headquarters as a business service group supporting our projects, mainly with field technology and processes. And what's great about my role is I'm very project focused, so I'm able to get out to the project sites to really understand what's happening and some of the challenges that they're facing, not only from a technology standpoint, but kind of seeing everything evolving, firsthand. And then being back in the corporate office and seeing how some of the more support roles are leading this effort and how they're addressing it. I would say from that poll at Mortenson, our leadership was very quick to react to many of the things that were going on in our backyard, obviously, in the past year and a half, and have been very vocal that a change needed to happen, and have started to lead some of those conversations without the team member individual having to do it themselves. So they've been a conscious effort of putting something out there in the culture of starting to have the conversations versus waiting for the conversation to happen. I would say, like all companies, it's still very new. And I think we're having these conversations and we don't really know what we're getting out of it quite yet, which isn't a bad thing. It's a work in progress, but they've definitely started somewhere and have noticed when things are going the right direction, whether it's having lunch and learns, having it come from leadership, or having it come from more boots on the ground folks, but have started to really address it as a culture versus just a problem that's going on in society.
Yeah, and I do want to acknowledge that Mortenson is one of the founding members of Construction Inclusion Week, which was launched last year. So I'm excited to have your perspective added, knowing that a lot of that leadership was taken through your executive team. So very, very, very excited to have you. Thank you, Alison, for being with us today. Dr. G, I'd love for you to go next. And by the way, it's birthday time. I don't know if Nathan said it, but Dr. G, we have Nathan's birthday today, as well as Brent's birthday. So happy birthday to all you January 20th babies. And with that, Dr. G, I'd love for you to introduce yourself as well.
Well, super excited. Thank you, Sasha, so much. It's, rare to have three of amazing dynamic panelists, from the four of us, but three of us that have birthdays on the same exact day. So I'm super excited to celebrate not only with them, but also with the Construction Progress Roundtable and all the people here today. So my name is Dr. G, and I am, which is Giovanna Brassfield. I am the CEO and principal consultant with Brassfield and Associates. And so our primary market is both looking at support in reach when it comes to helping organizations define and implement, from employee resource groups to trainings when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, then also looking at sustainable practices that can be implemented to help the organizations thrive. And also, I assist organizations when it comes to responses for those requests for proposals. So really looking at intentional ways in which they can be inclusive, not just for the project pursuit, but actually building up communities. So from small business perspective, workforce, youth engagement, and then also those charitable organizations. And I also have the honor of serving as the chair for the Associated General Contractor of California's steering committee for DEI, and it's such a great opportunity to be supported by such an amazing organization and member organizations to really elevate the conversation of diversity, equity, and inclusion across the state, and working alongside many different amazing change agents within this space. So I think we had a chance to really kind of level set. And I think when Sasha highlighted that chart from NAWIC, which is the National Association of Women in Construction, as well as ABC, there was a lot of rich data there, a lot of great, in that one particular slide, it was very encompassing of so many different data points. And the interesting part is we talk about just women and more needs for women. We've been identifying this need. She said for 20 years, we've been talking about it. And the stat that we had in 2020 was we were 8% of industry. Right. And that's just overall. That doesn't break out into the ones that are working in the field. But then also, if you look at the recent stat in 2021, 2010 was 8%. And then 2020, we're at 10.9%. So we've seen very small incremental growth over that period of time. So the hope is that these conversations, these difficult conversations and very intentional conversations, will yield change within women in construction, because there's a lot of conversations, but then the beautiful part is there's actions now more than ever. There's a focus, there's elevation of the conversation of why. And I think when we talk about just salary, 99% in construction of salary equal, right? That's phenomenal. Other industries don't have that. So we still have a lot of work to do across other industries, but as we're looking specifically today at construction, that is pertinent information of how we can make sure that we're evolving and having those allies, and why this conversation is so critically important to have more women from that 10.9% to get a little bit more. I don't have a number, but get a little bit more. I've heard so many people say 50%, 47%, but I'm just asking for more women in the industry. So when we had our poll just a few seconds ago, when we looked at those different 4 or 5 different options, that's real. There's so many organizations that I have a chance to even talk with or hear from my meetings with AGC of California steering committee members that organizations across, for us, is looking at the state of California specifically, but even talking with Henry Nutt, who serves as AGC's National Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Chairperson. And looking at the national perspective, there's many organizations that hadn't started, right? And there's hesitation of the starting, but they're having the basic generic conversations of what is it, level setting, defining the terms. But now is the time for action and really developing those actions. So when we look at the industry as a whole, long-term, what does it look like for allyship? What does it look like for really being inclusive? What does it look like for sustainability of all these? I mean, a lot of dollars are being spent now in the research and development, in the process planning, in the strategic planning. But now it's going to be really critical to really assess how effective and efficient and genuine we are at changing or moving the needle. So it's great to be in today's conversation.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, I'm excited by the wealth of experience you bring, not only from your own personal experience in industry, but the many ways that you are leaning in and participating in driving from a leadership standpoint, driving this conversation forward. So I'm excited to have your opinions and perspective added to this, Dr. G. So thank you so much. Brent, I want to give you a chance as well to introduce yourself. You're not a stranger to the CPC Roundtable conversations. I think we've had you back almost more than any guest ever, which says a lot for the work that you do and your leadership in industry, which we're so grateful for how you are showing up in this conversation. So please go ahead, introduce yourself.
Okay, so Brent Darnell, I have my own company. I teach emotional intelligence and critical people skills to the industry. And my focus on diversity, inclusion, equity, belonging, that kind of training centers around, we start with the foundation of the individual and their emotional competence, because if you don't have fundamental emotional competencies like empathy, emotional expression, emotional self-awareness, you're going to make some mistakes. So we start there, and every individual will be working on different things. Maybe it's working on assertiveness, that you speak up in these scenarios and become an advocate. But whatever that is, it affects your ability to implement, participate in, advocate for. So we look at the emotional profile first, and then things like communication skills and relationship skills. That all plays into diversity and inclusion talks in your companies. And we use a lot of research-based stuff on what works and what doesn't. There's a great article, Jane Bozarth created this article about, according to the research, what works and what doesn't. And just like our leadership courses, awareness alone will not change behavior. So you have to have some behavior models. You have to have some really set behavior models that allows you to understand what you're supposed to do in those situations to become an advocate. So we have to create the model, have the leaders model the model, have them teach it to other people when those things come up. That's one of the things that I think people will start these diversity and inclusion initiatives with the best of intentions, but it's usually surface level, I've found, and it doesn't create that change that they're looking for. So we try to dig a little bit deeper. That's our approach.
As you know, with anything, let's think about just extracting materials from the planet or anything. You really are not going to get the best quality at the surface. You've got to dig deep. I think the same, it's an analogy, I think the same with ourselves as people and as organic human beings. There is a lot to be discovered underneath that surface. So I think the work that you're doing, Brent, is incredible. I've personally have benefited from many of the links that you shared with me as I strive to continue to evolve as a leader in industry. So thank you so much for being here today and for adding your perspective to this panel. So it's at this point, we really want to look at digesting. So one of the ideas we want to ask today is, what does it mean to be an ally? Brent was talking about being an advocate. We wanted to focus this roundtable on being an ally. There's a lot of new language we have that's helping to navigate this conversation. But much like every other thing that we understand, and especially construction technology and all the acronyms in industry, defining language and defining terminology is so important in order for everyone to calibrate around the same concepts. So we wanted to start off with identifying what is an ally. We pulled this definition from Procore's Guide to Allyship, and I wanted to just touch base on it quickly so we're all oriented around the same idea. An ally is someone who takes action to support an underrepresented or marginalized group, but is not themselves a member of that group. So one can be an ally for members of any underrepresented or marginalized group, and that's everything from that's defined by racial identity, gender identity, disability, nationality, socioeconomic status, faith, identity, or even sexual orientation. So we're looking for someone who's outside of that underrepresented group, who takes some sort of action to support those. And I think that that's an important piece here that we wanted to really dive into, to make sure we have definitions around what does this idea of being an ally mean. So I want to now bring it back to the panel. Dr. G, I want to start with you. From your perspective, when you're looking at the advancement of inclusion and diversity conversations in industry, with over 50% saying, I haven't had to have those conversations in my firm, I think that says a lot. But what, from your perspective, is working and what's not working when it comes to the advancement of inclusion and diversity in construction?
I think just starting out when it comes to just having those conversations and really diving not only into the safe space, which is the acknowledgement to say there is a problem, to say that we need to be more inclusive, or we need to be allies, we need to support one another, like we had that slide just a few seconds ago. And we dove into what is allyship, but it's going beyond that. So it's diving from the safe space to now that brave space. And there's so much research by Brene Brown that looks at defining vulnerability as uncertainty and an emotional exposure where you're diving deeper. And I look at it like I was in this workshop that RAND had for their Center of Advanced Racial Equity Policy, and they had an iceberg, a visual of an iceberg. So they talked about how safe space obviously is the part that's above the water, right? You're safe, you're talking about things that you kind of see, you know that there's differences, you know you should be fair, you know should be equal, you should support one another. The marginalized community, there's all that's very obvious when it comes to being an ally. And then diving deeper underneath the water is the aspect of like that brave space, which is blends into what Brene Brown talks about, the vulnerability, the being able to have different perspectives, to lean in and fear. Like she has 6 different principles under her umbrella, critical thinking. I mean, the list goes on and on that she dives in. And so in Rand's research, they talk about that same concept and how it's important in order to really push and change where we're trying to go in the trajectory. Like we had Brent just talk about, it's very surface level, right? Because you have the top of the iceberg, the surface level, everyone sees it, we know it. But it's diving deeper into that intentional and strategic and long-term thinking about change and having those often difficult conversations in that brave space where you know that, like you talked about calling up, you know, it didn't sit well with me. Let's talk about what it can be. How do we learn from one another? So the brave space will be that vulnerability and talking about it, but not coming from a place of I'm trying to hurt you, but I'm trying to understand and learn. And you're unlearning what you've learned, right? In that space, in essence, because you're thinking about things differently than all you've known.
I agree with you. And I think it's so important. Brent touched on this, you touched on this, that we actually have visual aids to help us create constructs or our mental models around a lot of these concepts, because it does help us in kind of aiding that journey. Alison, for you, your perspective and you know the time that you have spent in your career, I'm curious, in this new stage, being with Mortenson in Minneapolis, where a lot of the heart of these conversations were started from a societal standpoint, what has been your experience and where do you think things are working and where are they not for construction specifically?
Well, so coming up from industry, 25 years ago, it was completely different. It was a platform where you just kind of sucked it up and you didn't say anything, and that was okay. But now there's this new opportunity, like I can say something and I'm not going to potentially get passed up for a job. And so I think there is my generation that, yeah, you were a woman back then and it was new and it was a brand new concept and you kind of fought your way through. But now it's, how do you change yourself behavioral so you can help the others coming up, the younger generation, to let them know that it is okay to say something, and that you don't need to be silent, or it's not the perception of the industry to kind of be, the tough person on the construction site, where you have to, there is a softer side to it. And I think with that, it's also, even, kind of being empathetic to some of that other generation that knew that, things weren't working back then, and kind of understanding that they're not going to get it right and they're going to say the wrong things, but how do you kind of meet them halfway and help them feel like they can be empowered to still speak up too, even though they're stumbling through this new concept of speaking up and not just kind of suffering in silence. It's also a Minnesota thing too, on top of all of this, you just be passively like not say anything. So add that on top of it too. But I think Dr. G kind of said something that resonated too, of, we're saying all the right things and we're putting all these plans and actions, or, things in place, but now it's time to take action. And so I don't know if anyone knows what action looks like. And so I think we're trying to figure out what might be actionable for me might not be actionable for somebody else that's struggling from a DEI standpoint too in my industry. So.
Yeah, and I think it brings up a very good point, which is the human brain really likes clearly defined topics, subjects, people, that this is where bias comes from, because the brain is an electrical circuitry, if you will, that the shortest distance from point A to point B based on that electrical current or neural synapses. This is what the brain is hardwired to do. So as you learn, you shortcut and you have a basic understanding of something and you can label it, recognize it quickly, not spending your cognitive energy on all of these things that should become muscle memory. So because of that, it's important to remember each of us is different. Each of us is at a different state, a different part of this journey. And the bias is a function of your brain in order to work effectively. I think what you brought up here, and Dr. G did as well, is we're talking about, if we understand that that's how the brain works, and if we understand that we're entering a space where we want to have these conversations where there's sometimes 5 generations represented under one roof, there's going to have to be that tolerance that's built into the organization to have those conversations in the space of, I was unaware that offended you. I would like to understand more. How did that offend you? And I'd like to be able to have a dialogue to understand. And I think it's in that space that we're talking about, because it's from that space, understanding is and potential empathy can be gained in order to then inform what that action looks like. Brent, as our brave male on this panel, as you oftentimes are, leaning very willingly into this space, I want to hear from you. What is, from your perspective, you're having a lot of these conversations, what's working, what's not?
Well, I think Dr. G and Alison really were spot on with what they observed, and to me, the key is the vulnerability, because you've got a decade after decade after decade of this hyper masculine work environment where you can't be vulnerable and you can't ask for help and you can't make mistakes. And I think that ingrained culture is so much there that people are so afraid to make a mistake that they're not doing anything. And so I think it's about opening up that discussion. And see, that ties into so many other things like health and safety and mental health and suicide prevention. It's about opening yourself up, being vulnerable, showing empathy, connecting with each other as human beings. And that's where this starts. And without that, I think we're sort of putting the cart before the horse and having program work and things implemented before we have that discussion about we are all going to muddle through this and we're going to have to show some vulnerability if we're going to make any headway here. And that is a tough discussion to have, especially for, I work with a lot of field folks and they don't want to have these kind of discussions. It's really uncomfortable for them. And I get that we're like the white guys and the middle-aged guys are part of the problem, but we're struggling as well. So we want to be in this. The guys I talk to, they want to do it. They're just so afraid to make a mistake that I think they're holding back a little bit. That's what I'm seeing. What's working is we're talking about it. Yay! So at least we're having these discussions and we're really starting to sort of wade through this work. And that's the important part of it. And that's what's great. And that's what's happening.
And Brent, I was going to say, Brent, you just mentioned something just so powerful, that being afraid. Far too often, that is the reason why there's nothing done, right? Because they're afraid to make a mistake or afraid to say the wrong things or afraid to go into HR now, right? Say something wrong, then they're in the HR, there's a lawsuit, there's a just dramatic issue. Yeah. But how do we navigate from those actions? I think you touched on it actually earlier when you talked about actions and the next steps needed and listening intentionally and how to, but in that listening intentionally, there's that learning that has to happen when we're talking about developing allies. It's learning, how does one marginalized community want to interact? How do they want to be perceived? And it's almost like a reverse mentoring and such, right? Yeah. Where you're having one party learning from another party, and it's information sharing and building because you get to see their perspective on the other side. While, someone might ask me about being an African-American woman in construction, I'm also learning their perspective as well too, right? And that's together we grow and we become stronger because there's also a lot of over things we have to overcome in that journey with the actions and steps.
You bet. Spot on.
And I wonder, one of the questions that was asked in the chat was, what do you do? And I would love to get each of your perspectives on providing some counsel here. What would you do if some of those things that are being said are coming from your boss or somebody in leadership within your company? Navigating that piece of it. Alison, I'd actually like to start with you, and this is in the trenches, real world scenarios. What would be your counsel and guidance there?
I think it's what makes you most comfortable. I would say me 15 years ago, I would never be comfortable having that conversation, probably not even me 10 years ago. So I think you need to be in a position where you feel like you are in a safe space and you can have that conversation and that it's going to be received well. And if you don't think you can, then you need to, that's when it goes back to who is my ally? Who is going to help me have this challenging conversation and make me feel empowered where I can have it the next time this happens, I feel like I can have it with success.
Yeah, and I think this is, again, why we wanted to talk about defining what that ally means, because this is why we need to understand the constructs and the framework. One, so you know who to look to. If you understand, I need to have a conversation and I need there to be somebody here who can be my ally in this conversation. Or I am the ally. That is me. I need to step up and I need to be brave and have that conversation. Dr. G, I'd love to get your input on it.
This question is just for me, it just brings me back to a moment where I was challenged with this whole speaking up about something that needed to happen. And so I remember it was right in the heat of all the rise, right? Because it's been going on for some time, but the rise of the social issues that were happening across the country. And I had to take a position. The position I was hired to do, which is advocate for others, advocate for the voice, and being that liaison with leadership in our executive leadership team. So we were getting ready for our messaging to go out regarding all lives matter, right? All lives matter. And everyone knows, I mean, and now looking back at that time, it was a specific ethnic group having an issue, but then everyone elevated at the same time by that as a foundation. So, because there's a need for all, I got the thin line, but at that particular point it was George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, right? What does that mean? How do we say that, but then being inclusive for all? And I remember we were working on messaging and we were talking about all lives matter. And I had to have that difficult conversation with our leadership. And I started by saying, that's, again, I thought about being brave space, being vulnerable. And I remember reaching out to him saying, we have a foundation, you and I, on open and honest dialogue. And when it comes to difficult conversations, I don't want to shy away from that. And then from there, I set the foundation, and then I told him why he should take a position on Black Lives Matter. And not all the stuff that goes behind it. Like I know there's all the political stuff, not even that, just being the equal and important, and meaning that was the moment, that was the intentional moment at that time. And then from there, rolling out a truly inclusive program to be all inclusive and defining what does all inclusive mean, right? With actions and steps and conversations, we did a forum across the country, going and hearing what employees wanted. So there was that, because that one conversation, difficult conversation, because I was like, literally my mentors and my coaches, it was a Saturday. I remember I had to do it. The print was supposed to come out on a Monday. I was in the office working, getting some stuff done Saturday. And then when I saw his email come through, he said he was going to say, this is the proposed messaging. It took me 5 hours to get in the zone to have that difficult conversation, right? Because I'm like, I don't want to end my career. I don't know what to do. I don't know. But that's why they hired me, right? In essence, right? That's why I'm there to advocate for others, making sure that we have equality, make sure there's no unconscious bias playing a role in the messaging, make sure the messaging clear. So I had it. But again, it's those difficult, often brave conversations that need to be had more often, right, within our industry. Because I think, Alison, you touched on it, right? It doesn't happen as much, and that vulnerability just needs to occur more within us professionals across the board, because it is a difficult conversation. Especially for me, I'm a single mom. I'm here at the top. What do I do? What does that look like? So.
I love that you said that you waited 5 hours, because I think that was you, like, knowing, like, I can't let my initial gut reaction dictate what comes out of my mouth, and like knowing yourself well enough to like say, I need a minute to really say what I really want to say. And I think that's what people are afraid of too, is because, a lot of times the first reaction you have is like anger, or you're mad, and that's not what you want to say. And so I think taking that minute and like being like, I know I need to take a second to really understand what I want my brain to have my mouth say versus everything is important.
Yeah, because it had to be, you're right. It had to be removing the emotions behind it all, right? Removing the opportunity, especially at that time, everything that was going on the TV, right? The media, the fighting, just the chaotic period of our country at that time. And I just had to step away from all that. You're right. And it took me those 5 hours was intentional thought. My mentors were supporting and giving me the journey in thinking, right? And helping me remove that emotion and really come back to him and start a foundation of honesty and truth and openness.
Yeah, and I hope the panelists can check out the chats as well, because Takoya just made a very, very good point, which is making that distinction between calling up and calling out. And that, yeah, calling up maybe sometimes can be done, something that's done in private in order to create that space for exchange. But really, when we're looking at some of these offensive things, which have been said for generations, there needs to be a public calling out in order to create the forum and for that discussion. And I think Dr. G, you just as she chatted that and you started to tell your story, which I thought was a great example of that. Brent, I'm love to hear your perspective as well on this idea, this question.
Well, first of all, my unconscious bias on the manager that made the error automatically went to the middle-aged white guy. So I thought, so there's my bias going out. But then I thought, I have such privilege in this situation because I can go to that guy and say, listen, dude, not okay. this is 2022. You cannot say that anymore. And really really have a real frank discussion about it. Why do you think that's okay? And you guys have to tiptoe around that. I hate that for you. I wish it was different, and it will be different. We just have to work through this stuff. But the first thing, see, you guys are talking about what does the person that's offended say. I want to start with the guy that said it. Because I'm going to look at his emotional, I can tell you what his emotional profile is. He has low self-awareness. He has lower empathy skills. He has lower interpersonal relationship skills. He is not good at this stuff. And it's made worse because he's so afraid to make a mistake. So I would start with the guy that's doing that, or let's be frank, it's mostly the guys that are making those mistakes. Let's get with them. Let's look at their emotional profiles, whatever deficiencies they may have that may prevent them from really embracing this work on those things first, and then move forward with the examples and the modeling and changing behavior. So. And
I want to leave, if Alison or Dr. G, if you have anything to follow that up, I want to create space. If not, I kind of want to, okay. So I think, first of all, I love the trust that exists within our community here to have this conversation and to have this conversation openly, because it is giving light to what I think many feel and are experiencing and think. And I want to bring in another model to look at potentially outside of this conversation, just to say there's nothing new under the sun. And some of this should look very familiar to many of you who are tech evangelists in the construction industry, who've been, trying to bring technology to evolve the construction industry and move forward. This is really the very same thing we experience when we talk about, a great new technology has been launched. Everyone's buying into what the promise of that technology is, and it just shoots off like a rocket. And then we go into the trough of disillusionment as we realize, well, shoot, this is hard. This is a lot harder than we thought. And it's looking at what I love the book, The Messy Middle, because it explains that this is a part of any time you want to create change, you want to innovate, you want to do something new. This is what you will experience, this messy middle. I believe this is where we are, which in my mind is progress, that we are actually in the messy middle. And if you've not read this book, I highly encourage you to do so, because it allows you to give yourself some grace and permission, and give that to others as well, to really recognize there is going to be that trough of disillusionment. If you look at the graph, it actually uses an explicitive when he shows like the excitement and joy of starting, and then where you hit that trough and it's like, ugh, this is effing hard. And I feel like that's a little bit of where we're at in this conversation as an industry, is where we're in that this is hard. And for progress to take shape, it's not going to be a linear journey. It's going to be us living in that uncomfortable space, but over time, hopefully we're elevating. I love Damon says, in my honest opinion, or in my humble opinion, I think it improves with each generation. I would agree with that. But it's those 5 generations under one roof, accelerating, changing at different rates of speed, that creates what is this messy middle that we're in. And so what I want to kind of talk about is, what does allyship look like? So when we think about the conversations that we're having, and we're talking about addressing bias, calling others up, sometimes having these public forums of calling the behavior out, what does that conversation look like? And I want to hear from our panelists, when you think about this, what does that space look like? How do we have this conversation within our own firms? And Alison, I'd love to start with you. And what does allyship look like? How do we have these conversations?
Well, I think they need to obviously not happen because something's happening in our world. And so I think we've learned that, and we're making a very conscious effort, and we're trying to bake that into our culture. I think having leadership really walk the walk and talk the talk is important, because those are who's leading our company, and they're making those business decisions. And if they can bake that into their culture and find the importance of it, I think that certainly helps, that makes these conversations comfortable and often. And, making it more part of everyone's got a job to do, a day job. And so now I think there was this, not a hesitation, but almost a nuisance, that now I got to do this in addition to my job and all the other things that are expected of me. And you think about how that different is from someone in the office versus the field perspective. Two very different views and two very different experiences. And so how do you continue to promote that, as you can still do your day job in this, and we know that this is important. So, finding that allyship and finding those allies, I think it's often mistaken that, like, I have to find a woman, even though that's not the definition. But I think, is it because that's most comfortable to me, or what that is? And so, I've tried to take a very strong look at who else in my company do I feel very comfortable with, someone I could go to with anything that I see on a job site, whether it's something about safety or inappropriate behaviors. And I know that not only are they going to take action on it, or it's something that they're going to take seriously and really help change culturally, versus calling that individual out. So I think, we talk about culture all the time. And if it's not in your culture, if it's just in the moment, we're going to react to something going on, it's not going to go anywhere, and it's just going to go back to business as usual. But if that company can continue to make this be a regular thing and something that they find important, then it's got a chance for success and to continue to be successful.
Agreed. And I think that's why we have Brent and Dr. G also on this panel, because this is not a journey I think any business leader should be taking alone. If you're reading what some of the comments in the chat, this is an organizational challenge that needs to be addressed from that organizational perspective. Dr. G, I wanted to get your weigh in on, what does this conversation look like for us currently in industry?
I would say, great question. I would say it looks like action. It looks like, just to build on what Alison highlighted already, it looks like intentional action, because we've been talking about it, but actually creating that gateway for intellectual and emotional exchange to happen. And the action I'm talking about is really taking the initial steps to advocate for those marginalized communities, or even underrepresented communities, when it comes to the bigger picture of what does it look like to be more inclusive. So we're building on the need for allyship to create work environment where many underrepresented people feel supported and they have opportunities to succeed, in essence. And so focusing, on those unconscious, I think someone said it earlier, conscious and unconscious biases, to build a better, more inclusive leader and organization.
And that, I think, even in the language we're using around this is intentional, conscious and unconscious bias. I remember the first time I sat in unconscious bias training, and all my experience and all the work that I've done, which I consider myself an artist in the business world. So try to very much be in touch with emotional intelligence and what's happening around me. But just in sitting in that training, I learned so much from a neuroscience standpoint, which many of my assumptions were flat out wrong, just flat out wrong. And so having that understanding of unconscious bias by definition means this is not an intentional slight or offense. This is some part of the way the brain works. And we need that understanding amongst ourselves so that we can have that journey, if you will. So what Nathan has actually put up here was part of training that I went through, that Procore offered to all of its employees to help us as leaders as we're navigating some of these conversations. And I was introduced to this concept and just loved it. It's the inclusive leader continuum. So essentially you have 4 different stages. And the first stage or phase one is just completely unaware, have no idea, no concept of something you say, your behavior or action could have any connotation or offense to be taken as offense to someone else. And then phase two, you become aware. However that happens, called up, called out, however, whatever form or shape that takes, all of a sudden you become aware. Something I just said did not land well. And that awareness is that really where I think some of us are getting stuck because we're afraid to take the next phase, which is an active phase of essentially leading with curiosity to say, I want to stop for a moment and just, I noticed a reaction to what I said. Are we okay? The ability to take action there through curiosity. And if someone does make you aware by calling you up or out, by being able to pause and say, I'm so sorry. That's not my intention. That was not what I meant. I want to understand how that made you feel. Engaging in that space where there's an active sense of understanding. And for me, this is a continuum that continues. This isn't getting a new job. This isn't starting new relationships. I think we're all familiar with each of these phases. But what we're talking about today around being an ally is really the fourth phase, which is taking that awareness and understanding, which hopefully breeds some empathy and self-awareness to say, I'm now going to become an advocate. I'm going to take some sort of action. And the beauty of this framework is this is not a destination. You don't wake up one day, you understand, and you'll never offend. If you're married, you understand this really well. If you're divorced, as I am, you probably understand it even better. But it's literally, this is an ongoing process. It's a framework for something that's continuous and ongoing. And I think that's the understanding we want to share when we talk about unconscious bias, is how do we move in this framework in order to have those conversations. And Brent, I kind of want to get your input here, looking at that framework and that chart, which essentially is almost like a framework for creating self-awareness. Get your thought on this space.
Totally. It's about that journey of understanding what you're saying or doing. It may not be appropriate. And first of all, let me just address something in the chat. If you go to brentdarnell.com/resources, there's an emotional intelligence test you can take there. And it'll tell you what the profiles it sees, and it'll also tell you how that affects things like diversity and inclusion. So I offer that for everybody. But see, here's the thing. We're bumping up against culture again, because the old school culture of construction is very teasing. There's a lot of hazing. And that is where some of this inappropriate stuff comes out. So I think it's about especially, I mean, I get that we have to make sure that the people who are being offended call the people who are offending out, and let's have that discussion. But also, the guys need to hold the other guys responsible and accountable. It's just like Alison said about the leadership has to walk the talk, and you know that's I mean that's important, but it has to be also on a job by job, office by office, project by project. The guys, when they see something inappropriate, they say, man, not cool. Don't say that. And here's why. Let's talk about it. And those discussions are starting to take place because people their awareness is being raised. They're seeing that what they're saying and doing is not appropriate, and they're changing their behaviors, but they're also having discussions with others that are exhibiting those same kinds of things. And that's where you start to really get changes, because then it doesn't become something that's sort of placed on everybody. It's something that's a grassroots kind of thing that permeates everything that you do.
Yeah, I think, I mean, Brent, just another great point. You just keep dropping so many different nuggets that draw like different thinking. Both of you are just phenomenal. So when you think about just what's going on with allyship and diversity, equity, and inclusion, most organizations, a large population of organizations are crowdsourcing it. right? They're having their employees carry all this effort in addition to being the design manager, the project manager, the VP of HR, all these things that they have to do in their core function of business of what they signed on to do, which is to be the employee in this space, right? And so then they have to take on the extra, like, and do it well, be open, think about all these things. And that's not their space, that's not their strength, but they instantly have to now be the expert inclusion specialist, right? In addition to their day-to-day job. And so, yes, the organization leaders, the ELTs, executive leadership team will take the position of doing this and having an ally, having unconscious bias conversations, being more inclusive. The list goes on and on. But then how does it get to the actions? I think we started off earlier, and you're seeing the crowdsource, which is not the best solution. You're seeing the drop or even the loss of momentum, the employees getting burnt out. And I mean, some of these organizations, they're like, I don't even want to do this volunteer committee anymore because I still got to focus on my deliverables. I see Alison nodding her head. It's across the industry.
Yes.
And that fatigue is what we don't want. Which is why I love books like The Messy Middle, because it allows us to calibrate against what we're setting out to do, which is to shift a course, especially when we think of construction. And I love the way Brent kind of breaks construction down from an EQ standpoint and personality, because then it does make a lot of sense. This is an industry that is built on grit. It's built on your ability to be thick-skinned, to be reactive. Sometimes he or she, usually who yells the loudest wins. Like, these are how outcomes are determined. So I think when we look at the work at hand, it's important to recognize this is not going to be easy work. It's going to be challenging. We're going to sit in some uncomfortable spaces. But I'm very, and maybe it's because our participants today who are participating with us are in that spectrum. But I'm very. It's a positive movement for me to see only 5% said I had a conversation, it didn't go well. That, to me, I'm excited to see. But I want to do another poll because I want to get the audience. I want to see where you're at when we talk about. Now that we understand, we've talked about what it means to be an ally. I want to know, do you have an ally in your career? Have you been an ally to one or more person? Have you been both? I know I've experienced it on both sides, but I want to know. I want to know from the audience where they are, what they're experiencing from this idea of allyship. And then when everyone has answered, we'll pull up. And then I really want to kind of dive into this with the panelists around, okay, now we're diving into this idea of taking action. I've had some experiences, but I'm really excited to hear the panelists talk through their experiences. So, okay, interesting. So we're looking at around 67% have said both, which to me, that makes total sense, because it's depending on where you are, at some point, someone is going to be an ally. So I think that's why we're looking at the majority. And it should be noted, 22% said neither. It's not had one in my life and have not had the chance to be one for other. Awesome. This is awesome, because maybe there can be an opportunity for you to either identify allies in your career, in your path now, or for you to become an ally. But I want to turn it back to the panelists and really kind of dive into the deliver portion of this conversation, really moving from kind of that safe surface level of how we have conversations into what Dr. G was talking about, that brave space. And so I want to know, do you see leaders making progress as they navigate these discussions? And Brent, I want to start with you, especially with some of the work you've done. Are you seeing progress from leaders on this front?
Yeah, I think definitely. And I'll give you a personal example. Somebody called me out because they said, you know what, if you're the big diversity guy and you're in this space, what are you doing? Where are you giving up your power and your status and your influence? And where are you really lifting people up? And they were absolutely right. And I wasn't probably doing enough of that. So the next time I spoke, I was speaking on diversity and inclusion. I called this person to help me. a Black woman to help me with this and split my fee with her and elevated her up and asked her to tell me, what am I missing and where am I going wrong and what's wrong with this? And bringing her into that discussion, I gave up power, I gave up monetary stuff. And I think we need to start looking at that as a level of allyship, of actually, you got to have some skin in the game. It's real easy to just advocate, but when you're giving up something that's precious to you, that's a true advocate. And I believe that we're starting to see more of that. We're starting to see men, especially the white men in this industry, step aside, lift people up, bring them forward, and allowing them to thrive, and allowing them to do their thing, and not have any bias toward, well, maybe they can't do that thing because of what they look like or their gender. You know, that's really diminishing. And from what I'm seeing, we got a long way to go, but I'm seeing a lot of progress in that. And that's, again, it's about giving up something that's meaningful to you. To me, that's true advocacy.
Alison?
Yeah, you know, my story is, and I would say every woman that has been in the field has a very similar story. And it's that breaking moment when you get the soup that wouldn't give you the time of day to finally listen to you. And it took me not being the know-it-all out of college that had the degree and acted like I knew what I was doing, to kind of just take a step back and let him show me the job and listen. And what I learned was, just by giving him a little bit of space and like acknowledging him for his talents, he was now listening to what I had to say. And at that time, there was allies, but it wasn't something we were seeking. But I found that completely pivoted my career for the way that I was more empathetic to the experience that a field person has versus the project manager, who's the more administrative piece of things. And I found that I could take that and resonate and have better conversations and be more empathetic to knowing where they come from and knowing that they were used to just running a job site and that's all they wanted to do. And it wasn't that they were insensitive. It's just that was what made them happy, is I want to get to the job and I want to get her done. And I don't want to stop and show you how to build a wall, you know? So I think that was that pivotal moment of me kind of putting aside my book smarts and really listening to somebody who came up from the trade. And we had this newfound, probably equal partnership of respect for each other.
And Dr. G, I'm curious to get your perspective here too, because you're coming from this, having had that role previously, now to kind of pivoting to say, I'm going to help many businesses and business leaders have that conversation. What are you thinking about where our leaders are from this standpoint of action?
I mean, they're looking for change. They're looking because they know that in order to generate revenue, in order to return on invest, all these things we talk about in the business model, right? To thrive as businesses, we have to do. Talking first about Generation Z, that's the big one. Everyone's talking about what are we going to do to retain workforce, and these kind of efforts, intentional efforts when it comes to inclusion, we have to do to make sure that workers stay within our organizations. So Generation Z, one of the things that everyone knows, they want a sense of belonging. But as we focus on Generation Z, there's still all the other generations that we got to make sure that we retain. And it's these kind of intentional allyships, being inclusive, diversity, supporting and growing. So you're seeing, you asked a question about progress, you're seeing organizations like, there's many actually that are doing some initiatives, but there's one industry which Alison's organization, Mortenson's part of, is the Inclusion Week, right? There's a celebration, a recognized celebration of inclusion, saying we have to be more inclusive as an industry. Then there's organizations like AGC of California, that from there we adopted some recommendations at the state level. And now we have from a task force now to a steering committee that is rolling out Like, how do we make these recommendations that were approved by the state board come to life and fruition? And so one of the things out of the 11 recommendations is really looking at intentional leadership training. And so we have a employee training and then also an executive training that will address and really have some meat and some skin in the game for executives. We're still flushing it out, but it's in the pipeline. The steering committee, amazing professionals, change agents within the state have been getting together to brainstorm, what does this training look like? And we have an amazing DEI manager in her name is Yuhi, that leads the charge and bringing it all together. Then there's also organizations like RAND on a national perspective. And I'm super excited to be aligned with both organizations at the ground level, working hand in hand to really elevate this conversation. But at RAND, they're doing this deep dive across industry to develop progress, doing more research, data collection, looking at the numbers, working with people, working with industries. But theirs is across the board, because it's not just a construction industry, even though we're here within the construction space diving into it. So I want to just make sure that everyone knows that it's across industry. This problem is real for all industries, like really being more inclusive, really being more intentional, having these difficult, often hard conversations, but especially within our space. How Brent and Alison already highlighted, there's these things that we have to do to have action. We have to have action, but we also have to have change. We have to get there. We have to scratch, as Brent put it, scratch deeper and not be just surface level.
Yeah, and Brent said, I hope everyone was listening, Brent said something incredibly powerful about the self-realization of giving up that power. And actually one of our attendees, Takoya Wise, wanted to comment on that. And I want to invite you, Takoya, now if we can unmute you, and I'd love to hear your reaction to that. Nathan is helping me.
She's unmuted. She might be having audio issues. Okay, we might have to come back. Darn, I was really excited to make this work. It's such a rare thing to be able to like pull an audience member in as a panelist on a webinar, right? But shoot, oh well, we'll try again.
Okay, well, if the audio gets worked out, interrupt me. I can be interrupted, no problem. But it doesn't surprise me that sparked a topic for discussion for Takoya, because I think what was said and what was represented there is incredibly powerful to recognize and understand some of what's at stake with certain individuals around this conversation. But that is not a barrier. That is not a barrier to stop this from leaders from really shifting their perspectives and becoming allies. Because one of the things I've always found so interesting about construction is that majority of these businesses started as family businesses that grew over time. And a byproduct of that is if you come from like me, and I have some toxicity in my family background, so sometimes the word family doesn't always mean safe, healthy, happy. And so for me, that idea of a family business, there's a little bit of a cringiness to that. But the reality of what I experienced being a woman in construction in the field was there was the ability for me to find allies when there was someone, and for me it was always men, who felt as an ally to me, some way almost like a parent, or looked out for me like their daughter. So they would create safe spaces for me in that moment in the field. I had some superintendents really support me in the field when there could have been dangerous situations, and I had superintendents stand up for me in the field, and I recognized that opportunity. I believe that is at the same place where there's that fear of giving up power because it has existed in that form. There's also the alternate of that, the other side of that, which is creating a legacy, being able to be a leader and think about your legacy and create that space. And Brent, I just would love for you to kind of speak to that a little bit before we start to wrap up.
Well, I think it's such an important point. What do we want this industry to be? And you know, a lot of the older guys I talk to, they discourage their kids from coming into the industry because of what it is and what it's sort of devolved into. But I'm a real optimist. What what if we created this amazing industry that was totally inclusive, where we did collaboration and all the projects were fun and engaging and full of people with different ideas and different backgrounds and different everythings. And I mean, what an amazing place that we could be and create. So I think it's about getting them to at least give the outline the vision for that before they go, and then advocating for that as they transition out of the industry.
Excellent. Nathan, did we get Quaya to have audio?
I believe we did. I see your video. Do we have audio?
Am I here?
Yay!
Like I ran across the house to get the other. I just wanted to quickly say, yes, kudos to Brent for actually taking a step back and doing like a self-evaluation to see where you were not necessarily uncomfortable in the conversation. Whereas, even to speak up and say something about something that has happened somewhere you've been offended is a dramatically uncomfortable situation. So what I would say to anyone who wants to be an advocate is exactly what Brent did. Get comfortable being uncomfortable. If we're going to have any change in this, everyone is going to have to be uncomfortable at some point in time. One easier way to get the conversation started, especially when you're talking about unconscious biases, is when you learn of an unconscious bias and you hear someone else repeating something you've learned not to say. The easiest way to stop that is say, you know what, did you know that what you're saying is based on incorrect information? Did you know that updated information, updated data has come out to kind of refute what you just said? So I feel like that is a non-threatening way to combat these unconscious biases that we all have. Everyone has them, and to kind of ease into getting comfortable being uncomfortable. Thanks.
Oh, love it. And I have no idea. Did I say your name correctly, incorrectly?
You got it. We've actually met, Sasha.
Okay. Thank you so much.
No
Thank you so much for that, because I think that is 100% true. We have smartphones that we carry in our pockets that get updated sometimes monthly. And we get challenged when we think about the language we use or the terminology not being appropriate. We all of a sudden get so afraid to be in that space when we live in a world where there is continual updates, progress.
Yes.
Just like your hardware, this hardware has, so I love that. Oh, I'm so glad you figured out, got your earbuds, and we're on. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, I know we're running out of time, so I wanna wrap up. I mean, this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much to each of our panelists for leaning in. Lillian, I know you're sending all of your energy being a participant with us as well. Such an important conversation, but I do want to wrap up and give Nathan some time to do some housekeeping from his side. Thank you so much to each of our panelists. Thank you to all of you who are commenting in the chats as well. Many of you continue to come back roundtable after roundtable. So thank you for the participation. Nathan, with that, I'm going to hand it back over to you.
Awesome. Thank you. Did you see I found my virtual birthday hat?
Nice.
Yeah, I will wrap up very quickly. So if you scroll up in the chat, all the links to the different references that were shared here, as well as, do you want to talk a little bit about the Project Ignite, Sasha, before we take off?
Yes. So, well, Nathan was,
Engage. Yeah, Project Engage.
Yeah, Project Engage. Nathan was nice enough to put all these resources. When we talk about bias to action and wanting to take action, AGC of California and Procore have joined forces to create Project Engage, which is a leadership engagement course all around culture, how to build culture. It's for executive, mid-level managers and everyone in between. And it's kicking off in California. That link will take you to a website to register. I think there are still slots available. This is a 12-month journey that is deeply immersive, but it gets very much into the heart of a lot of what we talked about today, which is culture. A lot of the content that is in here was informed by Dr. G and some of the work that she's doing with the Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity Committee with AGC of California. It is a collaborative effort, but it is one way to sign your team up to get into the thick of this and really look at creating the business that makes you the employer of choice for this next generation.
Awesome. Okay, so wrapping us up, again, this will be recorded, the webinar for those that want to register. It'll be on demand right away, or in a couple of weeks, we'll have the edited version out on YouTube. So go ahead and head to the YouTube channel to subscribe to that to stay up to date. There's also a great discussion that Sasha led back in September on mental health, the similar format that is, again, very, very informative for these softer skills topics that are so important for innovation within this industry. So again, our next upcoming event, a lot of the folks that were on the webinar here today will be with us in Denver in February. We got that link again here to learn more about that event and what we'll be doing. That does actually, we'll be doing a mental health section as part of the workshop. As well as I know Sasha can't give a keynote that doesn't include something about inclusion and diversity because it's just so paramount to everything. So I'm excited to bring all these topics together to solve our shared pains. And once again, thank you, Brent, Dr. G, thank you, Alison, for all of your bravery and honesty and helping us all get through this together and normalize these conversations. So these are fun for me, and I couldn't think of anything better to do on my birthday.
Oh, I love that.
Everybody was texting me like, "Oh, what are you doing on your birthday?" I'm like, "Oh, I'm hosting an inclusion and diversity webinar. I'm really excited." And they like think I'm joking. I'm like, "No, I'm genuinely excited about this."
Oh,
So thank you all
so much.